to start with a question. How many people on the session today work in health funded processes? So yay or nay in chat, please. Brilliant. Okay, so a real mixture. That's great. So I mean, health funded processes cover a massive amount of decisions. We've got an hour, so I'm going to be realistic in what we can cover. So I'm gonna touch upon a couple of the most common health funded processes, and then focus on advocacy and how to get an advocate. So this is my goal for the hour: a very brief overview of different health processes where a person might want an advocate, and then we're also going to look at when advocacy as a legal right will be triggered. And then if advocacy isn't a legal right, we're going to have a little look at what you can do and what options. Because you're advocates and we don't take no for an answer, do we? Do we? Oh. Okay, so just a little shout out now to pop yourselves on mute if that's okay, because it's going to be really distracting. We've got, I think, just over 100 people on the session. That would be much appreciated. Thank you. Okay, so what are health funded processes? So the main one that you will be supporting people with or accessing yourself will be Section 117 aftercare. So this is when you've been or a person has been detained under the Mental Health Act. So it could be under Section 3, or it could be under some of the forensic sections, so Section 37. And when that person is going to come out of hospital, their care, their aftercare, will be arranged under Section 117 of the Mental Health Act. And this is significant because it places a duty on the it's NHS funded care, and it, unlike Care Act, so adult social care that's arranged under the Care Act, that's means tested, so there's a financial assessment attached to that. If you're receiving Section 117 aftercare, it isn't. So you're either entitled to it or you're not by definition of you being detained under the Mental Health Act. So it should be straightforward to receive. That isn't the experience of many people, and there's lots. Kirsten in the previous session touched upon how challenging it can be to just get the funders to decide who's going to be responsible. And we're aware that there's lots of people where there can be to-ing and fro-ing and arguments, to go on to a better word, between the local authority and the NHS about who's funding what. So it can be quite complicated. Section 117 aftercare can cover a lot of different types of support. It can even include certain housing options. It can include care. It can include things like support with PAs. Anything really, as long as it's to do with the person's mental health condition and preventing that from deteriorating further. So that's 117. The second big process that advocates might support people with is going to be NHS continuing healthcare, and that's for adults. For children and young people, it's just called continuing care. But essentially, this is where the primary need is to meet a long-term health condition. So, and advocates can sometimes support people through those processes. Another big one that we're going to touch upon briefly is about personal health budgets. And in those three processes, as just identified above, you have a right for a personal health budget. I'm going to give you the exact explanation in a second, unless there's a reason not to. So you have a right to ask, and you should be given one unless there's a reason not to. And personal wheelchair budgets. Has anybody supported somebody with a personal wheelchair budget, or have you ever heard of a personal wheelchair budget? No, thanks, Johnny. You were quick there. Thanks, Kath. No, not yet. I mean, I'll be honest. I didn't know they existed until a few months ago. I mean, never heard of yet. It's that's really interesting. So, yay, we're going to learn something today. There's something called a personal wheelchair budget. And people can, I mean, I was watching a brilliant NHS England video over the weekend of a young man who had cerebral palsy, used a wheelchair, and he also had a PA to help with things like cooking and shopping and going out. He was 19 and he was going off to university, and he didn't want a PA. He didn't want his PA to go with him. He didn't want that support given that way. However, there was a wheelchair that offered him more independence, because it would do some very clever things. It would raise, it would lower, there were special foot plates, and that allows him to access things like the kitchen, you know, something as straightforward as a massive barrier if you don't have that ability to increase your height. And the money then went to his personal wheelchair budget, and the CCG and the local authority worked together to make that happen. And it actually saved money in the long term for the state, because he didn't have a PA, he didn't need a PA. It gave him much more choice and control, gave him the freedom to kind of live how he wanted to live with the support that he wanted. So it's a new thing. I think it came out last year. If you're supporting people who use wheelchairs, then, you know, please look to your local offer to see what's out there, because they are there and they are a part of that package of personalised care, particularly in NHS, that they want people to be accessing. Now, just pop down at the bottom that unlike adult social care and mental health, where there's a specific decision-making process or a specific set of criteria that will trigger statutory advocacy, in health systems it's more grey. It's more grey, because some statutory entitlements cross over, but in any of these themselves, there isn't like a bit of legislation that says, here you go, you can have an advocate. So that's kind of what I'm going to look at in a minute. But before we do, let's just have a little look at the personalisation agenda that we have in England. So NHS England and NHS Complaints, there's a massive drive to get personalised care. And the goal is for personalised care to become business as usual. And I mean, just look at how many people that this is going to impact, 2.5 million. And personal health budgets is a hugely integral part of making that happen, because personal health budgets, as you know, will help people take control. It gives people flexibility and choice, autonomy, you know, all those things. And the uptake of personal health budgets hasn't quite hit where they want it to be. And I think advocacy, we can play a part in that. We can play a part in the people that we support and serve, and talking to them about, do they want a personal health budget? Would that be a useful thing? And I guess for a lot of people it would be. Now, the universal personalised care, and I will put a link to these documents at the very end, so, and you can have the slides to save you Googling them. But one of the specific actions is about increasing personal health budgets. So this is significant, because you need to know that this is a national drive, that there's very much an agenda to make personalised care very real for people. This is a slide which kind of confirms the right to a personal health budget. So 2014 was the year where there was a right initially to consider requests. But then in October, look what happened. And it says a relevant body is required to grant a personal health budget unless it's not appropriate in the circumstances. So this, in effect, is giving people the right to have a personal health budget. Has anybody had trouble? Has anybody ever tried to support somebody access personal health budgets? I've heard kind of anecdotally about some areas saying, oh, you know, we don't do them, which is what we call bullshit. You know, that's not that. Yeah, we know what to call that. we don't do that. Is anybody, I've just heard anecdotally some services, so I hope that that's stopped now. Oh, Leanne, I liked your emoji there. That was impressive. Zoom emojis. I'm feeling young and down with the kids. Do a party hat one? Sorry, right. Emma said, local authorities are very vague about this and call it controversial as though it's something they don't want to talk about. Yeah, and I think, you know, use your standard advocacy, you know, rhinoceros, thick skin and pushing things through. Get that in writing, refer them to the guidance, of which there is plenty. You know, the guidance is very much on the side of personalisation. So Kathy's asked which legislation supports an expert. So I'm going to give the big list at the end where this comes through, but I'm not sure actually the bit of legislation, but the universal personalised care, and there's lots of guidance around personal health budget. So I'll absolutely give you the link so you can have them in your toolkit. Right then, let's have a little look at advocacy then in these processes. So if you're supporting, or if you yourself are going through and want an advocate for Section 117 aftercare, there's two kind of ways to get an advocate. If the person is detained in hospital, so the common section will be Section 3. As you know, that person will automatically be entitled to an independent mental health advocate. Now, an IMHE is there to help the person exercise their rights and to protect their rights, to understand the functions of the Mental Health Act and the restrictions that apply to them. And aftercare and planning for discharge, you know, getting ready for this and thinking about what support I want in the community, absolutely comes under this banner. You know, let's be clear that this is not an additional to IMHE. This is something that IMHEs can and should be getting involved in talking to people as their IMHE. Because the planning for Section 117 has to begin whilst the person's in hospital. The planning won't begin once they're discharged, because that's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? That's too late. It has to begin, the planning has to begin in hospital when they have an IMHE. Once the person is discharged into the community with Section 117, well, then it's likely that Care Act advocacy is triggered. And I've taken this paragraph directly from the Care Act guidance. So the Care Act guidance tells us that under the Mental Health Act, certain people will have help and support from an IMHE. And then it goes on to say Section 117 of the Mental Health Act places a duty on the NHS and local authorities to provide aftercare. And if we jump down a few lines, then it says those people who do not retain a right to an IMHE, whose care and support needs are being assessed, planned or reviewed, should be considered for an advocate. And if they have substantial difficulty of being involved and there's no appropriate person to support their advocate, then they should have an advocate under the Care Act. Now, what's interesting about that, I think, there's a few bits. One is those people who do not retain a right to an IMHE. Well, no one's going to retain a right to an IMHE once they receive Section 117 aftercare, because they'll no longer be detained. So everyone coming out of hospital under 117 will stop having an IMHE the minute they're discharged. So just think about that kind of timeline. You've got somebody in hospital planning for 117, and IMHE is there to help them. Then at the point of discharge, we need to think about Care Act advocacy. So as an IMHE, you guys need to be thinking about Care Act advocacy. So in your work as an IMHE, part of your discussions could be and should include who's going to support the person once they're outside of hospital, and do I help to trigger that? Ideally, you would continue in your advocacy role. I mean, that's the kind of the most sensible solution to that, isn't it? Is that the IMHA then carries on in their advocacy and then just wears a Care Act advocacy role, you know, and the person doesn't really care whether it's an IMHA or a Care Act advocate, and you deal with that in your paperwork, but essentially you provide that continuity. Right, I'm just gonna, I can see a couple of comments in the chat box. So Tom, you said who decides about what criteria is appropriate? So is this the right to have a personal health budget? So I think that a good example could be if the person lacks capacity, or perhaps if there's been significant misuse of personal health budgets in the past. I think that might be grounds to say no. But again, that should really be triggering a conversation, shouldn't it, rather than just a no, end of discussion, because there could then be alternatives. For instance, if the person lacks capacity, is there a family member who could manage that on their behalf, or a broker or a third party? So I'd still be pushing and exploring that. Hazel's asked, how long does a section 1117 section 117 last? That's a really good question, Hazel. The Mental Health Act doesn't put a time limit on it, so technically it should last as long as the person has the needs. So, you know, the short answer is as long as it's needed, which is unusual. Amy said, I have a Care Act case supporting the gentleman with regard to this specific statement. What statement's that, Amy? Sorry, I've lost the thread. At what point I said?
The one on the screen, Kate, so the information from the stat guidance. So I have a case that just fit nicely in with that.
Well done. Excellent. I love it when an advocate uses the code of practice. It gets all excited.
The worker was very keen for advocacy input, so we found it together, to be honest.
Excellent. Good. Georgina said, if someone is discharged from Section 3 and later told they were entitled to Section 117, I mean, that's terrifying, isn't it? That's an afterthought. That has to be picked up in the hospital. I think I'd be jumping all over that. I mean, I think that the short answer is yeah, because they're entitled to 117. So I'd definitely be getting some technical advice on that and maybe speaking to a solicitor. Right, sorry, there's a few comments and I don't want to miss any. What about the right to a health and social care integrated budget? Yes. So if in fact, we're going to come on to that, Colin, so if I can just hold that for now, if that's okay. Because yeah, there's lots of people who have both health needs and care needs that will be met by the local authority and by the CCG. Okay, but I'm going to talk about that. I've got a slide on that. Okay, right, and that's most of the questions. I can see other comments, but that's great. Okay, so that's kind of for the mental health. So most people receiving Section 117 aftercare, is the bottom line, can have a statutory advocate, and it kind of find a way of using that to your advantage to argue. Now, in continuing healthcare, and this is to come to Colin's point, if assessments and planning are being undertaken jointly between the local authority and the CCG, then Care Act advocacy will always be triggered. And all the provisions of the Care Act, which includes joint planning, so that's where the person has physical and perhaps mental and adult care needs, that can all be done together, and budgets can be pooled and worked through together. Now, even if the NHS are taking the lead and are doing most of the assessment or most of the planning or even most of the delivery of support, if the local authority is just involved in 1%, then advocacy under the Care Act is triggered. So that's very, very important, because even if the NHS are the lead providers taking the lead, advocacy is still triggered under the Care Act. And that's the bit to use if you're finding that you're coming up against a bit of a wall in getting that person an advocate. Now, the criteria for advocacy under the Care Act still remains. So very briefly, that's that the person is likely to face substantial difficulty at being involved. I've got to admit, I think that's most of us when we go through these processes, and that they don't have anybody who's appropriate to support them through. So this is a group of people perhaps who don't have any family or friends or natural allies who are willing and able. And that's not to kind of be judgy about that. You know, I remember meeting a parent a couple of years ago when Care Act was coming in. Gosh, yeah, it was about 8 years ago. And she said to me that she didn't want to be her son's advocate. She said, I'm mum. I want to be his mum. And she was saying to me, so I want him to have a separate advocate. And, you know, can he? And, you know, the answer is yeah. You know, nobody can force somebody to be the person's advocate. There's, you know, majority of family members, I think, will want to be the person's advocate. But we shouldn't assume. And, you know, for this mum, she was heavily involved in his life. She loved him dearly. But she wanted to be mum. And I think that's a really significant part of that working out, you know, not assuming. Christine, you've asked, does that apply when NHS has planned the care but commissioned the care from LA and has a local authority care coordinator? So yeah, it would, wouldn't it? Because they were saying that the local authority are involved in delivering the care. And if you look at the guidance, because that's what I do, you know, I go to the guidance. What does the guidance tell me? And the guidance tells me this. The guidance says that where it's assessed by the NHS and the local authority, where a package of support is being arranged, commissioned or funded, that's known as a joint package of care. That's going to trigger advocacy. Hazel said, sorry, meant to add what's under section 117, making them pay for the care out of benefits, which is causing distress, sending letters out. Yes, that sounds really, really poor, Hazel. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, thank you. Colin, you've preempted my slide later. Clever. I'm going to come and talk about advocacy as a reasonable adjustment. I absolutely agree 100%. So, yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, spot on. Right, so let's have a little look at continuing healthcare. So if local authority is involved in the teeniest amount, that's going to trigger Care Act advocacy. But there's a little bit more. So not many people know about this, but I think it's really, really significant that there were extra, you know, in the regulations for Care Act, the regulations said that advocacy can also be available wherever that assessment or planning process may lead to the NHS arranging placements for more than 4 weeks in a hospital or more than 8 weeks in a care home. And that's regardless of whether there's family involvement or not. Now, if you think about people with a learning disability and autistic people who have been in an institution, perhaps for 5 years, NHS are arranging them coming out into the community, then regardless of family involvement, that person has a legal right to have an advocate under the Care Act. And I think that the Care Act advocacy, we often get very, very fixed and used to working in the processes of assessment, planning and review and safeguarding. But this actually opens the door for another, which is about placement. And for people who are familiar with IMCA, this kind of mirrors the IMCA change of accommodation, doesn't it? But with IMCA, you need to lack capacity to trigger the IMCA. This group of people may have capacity, may have fluctuating capacity, or may lack capacity. You know, kind of includes all of those impairments, but it triggers advocacy. Amy, I work within this remit for patients who are discharged on fast track process. Brilliant. The issue I have with these cases is that the authority are not involved and tend to fail in their duties to protect. Okay. Yeah, I can see. Yeah, thank you for that. Did you want to come in and say any more about that? No. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks for raising that. I've just mentioned IMCA as well, around advocacy and continuing healthcare. So if there aren't single decisions to be made around serious medical treatment or long-term decisions about where the person lives, if that person lacks capacity and they don't have anyone who can act as their consultee in that decision, then an IMCA has to be instructed. So you can imagine here that somebody going through continuing healthcare could easily have a Care Act advocate to help them with the broader planning, let's say, and then they might have an IMCA as well on a very specific or single decision. They might even have a DOLS IMCA, or they might have a paid RPR. So a paid RPR is when a person is under a deprivation of liberty safeguard and they don't have anyone who can be their representative, in which case a paid representative will be appointed. And this is what the Code of Practice says. The Code of Practice says that the role of the RPR is to represent and support the person in all matters relating to the deprivation of liberty safeguards. And when I think about that phrase, in all matters relating to deprivation, I'm left thinking, how can that not include matters around care or treatment arranged under continuing healthcare? How can it not include matters to do with the personal health budget? You know, if the person uses a wheelchair, can that include accessing the personal wheelchair budget? Now, I don't think the paid RPR then has to necessarily be the person to support that decision-making process. But if you are a paid RPR and the person's receiving continuing healthcare, I would absolutely be asking questions about advocacy. And then it comes down to your local service. Can the person being the paid RPR take on the advocacy role to make sure that the person's rights are protected? Abby said there's a paid RPR attended CHC reviews of funding. Brilliant. That, I think that's, we need to see more of that. I think is the bottom line. Yeah. Nice. Really nice. Really quick one around complaints, just to mention, if people are thinking about making a complaint about any aspect of their health funded care, so section 117, continuing healthcare, personal health budgets, then they have a right to have a complaint advocate. But a complaint advocate will only get involved with the complaint. I think the other types of advocacy we've touched on the last 10-15 minutes, there's a lot more flex for that advocate to stay with the person through the kind of the broader process. Whereas a complaint advocate, I think, is quite focused on just the complaint. Okay, so I'm going to pause now for a second, because we're now going to look at what to do if the person doesn't trigger any of those. So before we do, if I've got any questions or any comments, we've got a little bit of time that you wanted to go through.
Can I ask a question?
Hi, Christine. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I have exactly this problem at the moment where we have a funded package of care. And sorry, I just had to run down the stairs to get something, so I'm out of breath.
Take your time.
I have a funded package of care under CHC. And so we put a complaint into the CHC people here. They forwarded that to the local authority. And I said they don't look at complaints because, and this was the weirdest conversation I ever had with anyone, although we fund the package of care, Plymouth City Council pay for it. I know.
Oh, right. That sounds quite strange. And I'm assuming you're pushing back on that. And
yeah, and I mean, I'm trying to find the right way in, because they've sent it on to the wrong people entirely anyway. But I'm hoping they meant that they commissioned the services that they're paying for from Plymouth City Council. But so would you think we would go to the CQC? Would we go, where would we make an NHS complaint about a funded package of care?
I would go back to the person who wrote that letter and ask them to outline the process you should follow.
Yeah.
And then follow that process. And if it sounds like it's nonsense, then I'd just have that conversation with perhaps a senior person, and yeah, go directly to NHS Complaints. I think the problem with NHS Complaints, I always remember Health Watch doing a massive spreadsheet, and it was an infogram. It was terrifyingly complicated. And I think there's something like 142 organisations that you could potentially go to if you've got an NHS complaint. You know, right, or if you're unhappy with NHS care, you know, right through the BM, you know, the British Medical Association, to the Midwifery Council, to PAL, you know, there's hundreds, well, 140 I think it was. So it can be complicated. So I guess my starting point would be to ask them to outline that.
Yeah.
Catherine said the health ombudsman can be handy for a bit of guidance. Yeah, there's absolutely no harm is in asking for guidance. You don't have to make a complaint. Yeah, great point.
And I see the comment there about the joint working team, because I have another complaint that's with the joint working team at the moment. But this is very raw. It literally happened on Thursday of last week, so I'm still trying to negotiate. But that sentence that they said, it just floored me. I thought,
it doesn't sound right, does it? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
Yeah, good luck with it.
Yeah. Hello. Can I just add to that?
Please.
Yes. I've just experienced a similar situation where the client was very confused because the payments going into their account were still marked SCC for Sheffield City Council, even though she'd recently been transferred from joint funding to full CHC funding.
Right.
It sounds like, although the money comes from the NHS, the payments actually go through the council, which I know doesn't make any sense. Seems a very long-winded way of doing it.
Yeah.
But that's what seems to happen.
That to me kind of shows the importance of accessible information being provided by these bodies, so that we're absolutely clear about. I'm always amazed when it comes to finances, how difficult it is to get what should be quite straightforward information. You're like, how much, by whom, for what? You know, that these should be straightforward. So yeah, just keep asking and insisting that you get that information. And if you need to use a stick to demand that information, I would say look at the Care Act, and Section 4 of the Care Act gives very specific duties on local authorities to provide information. The guidance for personal health budgets also gives specific duties on CCGs to make clear information available to people. I'm pausing because there's a knock at the door and I'm expecting my dog to go barky, barky face, which she's not moved. I think we're good to carry on. Right, okay. Tom, you've made a comment in the chat box. What about a person who doesn't receive an appropriate package of care because the local authority and CCG do not commission services to meet dual needs? Who should be complained to on what grounds? So without knowing the detail, my understanding is that it is not lawful to say straight off that we don't commission a particular thing. The Care Act is very clear that the duty is about meeting needs. It's never about providing services. So it's up to the local authority to consider how that person would want to have their needs met. Now, if there's a big gap, as you say, they're not looking at dual needs. So, I mean, it's just mind-boggling, isn't it, why that they would not do that. But I would absolutely be complaining. If you think that the local authority are not doing what they should be, then you can talk to the monitoring officer. So if you, I'll put that in the chat box. So find out who the monitoring officer is in your local authority and talk to them. And basically, the issue would be, I'd say I'm concerned that the local authority are not fulfilling their obligations because they've said they're not going to commission this type of service. I think that could be potentially unlawful. And then the CCG, you want to be complaining, because the whole point of personalised care is about looking at that person's needs, isn't it? And there's such a gulf between what the guidance says should happen and what we experience day to day. So as an advocate, and I know it's exhausting, I really do get it's exhausting, we've got to get that gap closer and closer by pushing and using the guidance to say that that's not okay. I know you know that, Tom, but it is tiring. Right, shall I move on then to what to do for people who fall outside of those catchment areas for advocacy? So the first thing is there's lots of shoulds and cans and mays and lots of considers in the guidance within personal health budgets, continuing healthcare, even continuing care. On the next few slides, we've copy and pasted what the guidance says. So I'm not going to kind of go through every single word, but you can have the slides after, and this is the bit to use. The point I want to make here is that the guidance is there to be used. So we can't use guidance to insist, but we can, of course, use guidance to ask. And any lawyer, you know, when they're writing letters, they will use this guidance as evidence to remind the decision-making body about what best practice is and what the expectations are. So use this guidance. You know, there's loads of it where it pops up about recognising that advocacy is useful. So this isn't saying you have to pay for an advocate, but it's saying that you need to consider it. So use this. I'm just going to flick on now. As I say, you can access this after to make that ask. And I wonder, if I'm being devil's advocate, I wonder how often we actually ask for advocacy to be paid, or whether there's an assumption that the commissioner will say no. I don't know if that's a bit controversial, that one. But if the commissioner says no about extending, you know, advocacy to groups of people, ask on an individual level. You know, think about your partner. You know, you've got your advocacy partner in front of you who wants advocacy. They're not legally entitled to it. Just ask your commissioner if they will support purchase, obviously given the reasons why your partner feels it's helpful. But I think most commissioners would be open to that. You know, most commissioners are not malevolent, you know, horrible rat bags sitting in an office. Most commissioners want to help people, want advocacy there. So ask them to spot purchase. Colin, here's your brilliant point earlier. If they still say no, ask if they will cover advocacy under reasonable adjustments. And this is taken from the Equality Act. And essentially, if you feel that your advocacy partner will be disadvantaged without advocacy, then that's the point to make, that without advocacy, they're going to be, you know, unfairly discriminated against and disadvantaged. Kathy said, we tend to have positive conversations about extending our service to include an individual who doesn't technically meet criteria of the contract, but we're clear. It's exactly what I'm getting at, Kathy. They're brilliant to see that you're doing that. I think that, you know, as I say, most commissioners, if you ask them, yeah, would say, and even if they say no, then we have got other routes here, like reasonable adjustments, to push back on that. To get advocacy into these processes. Gail, yes?
You can also get an advocate basically under personalised budgets as well. Personalised budgets can pay for paid advocacy. I know an autistic woman basically on Twitter basically, she's got a paid advocate to do specific work for her, because she finds it that she can communicate, she can self-advocate, but she finds it very difficult because of being so emotional basically, because of autism. we can speak for ourselves, but we find it so draining and emotional doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the link in, because I totally agree. You can explore, there's nothing to say a personal budget cannot fund one-to-one advocacy. Now, this should never be at the expense of, core other services. But the personal health budget, it's simply about an amount of money to support the person's health, which is, and care needs. So if that person feels advocacy is going to help them to live the life that they want to live, and that can be justified, well, absolutely explore if advocacy can be part of that support. So yeah, Colin, I think you're right, and it's brilliant to hear that that's been achieved with that lady. Brilliant. I think that's kind of controversial for some, because we often say advocacy should be free at the point of access. So it kind of sits a bit uncomfortably, this idea of it being included in a personal health budget or personal budget. But I think it's okay. I've got to admit, this is about, if the person feels advocacy is helpful, then why not? There's nothing to say it can't be. I'm just going to go back a slide. Gail, I don't know if you're able to talk, because this is one of Gail's favourite legal phrases. I don't know if you're there, Gail. She might be on a plane. But fettering their discretion. Have people heard of this phrase? Give me a yay or nay, or give me a yay if you've used it. Christine, yes. Kate's a lawyer as well. Brilliant. Oh, well, then you can explain this better than me. I'm feeling a bit out of my depth. But okay, well, for everybody who said no, yay, we're going to learn something. Woo, isn't this amazing? Fettering their discretion is, it's this general principle of law that means that whenever you make a request, that that body can't just kind of give a blanket decision, like what you were saying before, Tom, around we don't commission this, because that means that they have fettered their discretion and they've failed to look at the individual or exceptional circumstances that affect this person. So if the local authority say, no, we don't commission for people named Kate who are from Liverpool, then that would be them fettering their discretion. They have to look at my individual needs. Does that make sense? So it's about, and if you think that, I'm just looking at the Kate said about blanket policies, an example. So yeah, so they're not commission advocacy for a group of people. That could be an example of fettering the discretion. So if you feel that that's happened, simply, talk to a lawyer, and use that in your conversation, to remind the local authority that it is potentially lawful to fetter their discretion. Okay. Did I say that right, Kate? Gail said, I know Gail loves this, don't you, Gail? You used to use this a lot in your one-to-one advocacy. So yeah, if it's certainly a new area for me. I've only learned this in the last 12 months, but that, which is great, isn't it? We're always learning new ways. Emma, I've just noticed your hand's up. Did you want to come in?
Oh, hi. It's just a quick question. It made me think of something else, because I'm interested in helping children with special needs and their families. So often local authorities will say that the family have these complex needs, and you go to the local authority and then they say, well, we don't procure these services because these services are private, that we only procure through the state. But then if the child's needs can't be met except through a private provider, and then they use this general policy, is that something we could apply to that, or
Absolutely, and I'd start by getting that in writing, because I've got to admit, I think a lot of nonsense is said verbally by people who don't fully understand, kind of what the impact is. Like I've been in meetings before and been told some absolute stonkers, well, we can't. I mean, I think my favourite one was, a social worker said that, she said this absolutely certain. She thought that this was true. She said that if the person needed more than 4 visits of domestic help a day, then they had to go into a care home. That's what she said in a meeting. They had to go into a care home. And, after I picked myself off the floor, go, what? It's just ridiculous. No, you can't just put somebody in a care home because of a level of need. That's,
I was recently told by a social worker that after the age of 18, you cannot access social care from the state. I didn't know what to say.
Yeah, it's really concerning. And I think with a serious hat on, and because I don't think that certainly the social worker I was talking to is a bad person. I'm not here to demonize. She genuinely thought that. I mean, John, I don't know whether your person who said that genuinely thought that. So there's something about an advocate, about being that truth seeker, isn't there? And having that professional curiosity. So all I had to say in that meeting was, where does it say that? And she kind of looked puzzled. And then we said, is that written down? Is that a policy? And she said, oh, yes, it's a policy. Well, can we get a copy of the policy? And I'm thinking, if it's a policy, then that's a really stupid policy, because that's very easily challengeable. But of course, it wasn't a policy, because you can't have that approach. You can't have that approach. So there's something about getting it written down, getting it in writing, because then you can see which bits, and you can get your legal advice if there is a potential breach. I mean, hopefully just having a conversation, like my example was a conversation, are you sure? Should we check? Should we just check that before we go any further in this process? And then she came back and equipped with the correct information about meeting needs, about meeting people's needs in that flexible, person-led way. And that's what we do, isn't it, guys? As advocates, we're there to make sure that that person is the front and centre. And we just need services to catch up with that approach. And that's what we do, isn't it? That's what we do.
Thank you, Kate. That's great. Yeah,
I had a bit of a rant there, didn't I?
No, it was good. No, it was good, because the needs are complex and often the local authority can't meet them, but they will save money where they can. But obviously these children, they're so deserving and they need that help. So I think it's good as advocates. We push back, we push back.
Keep pushing. Yeah, absolutely. And if the service isn't commissioned, then I think the next question is, well, should it be commissioned? And how can it be commissioned? Is there a provider that could be commissioned? And again, to just throw in for the techies on the call, there's market shaping duties under the Care Act, which means if there's big gaps in the market, then the commissioner is under duty to look at that. Yeah. Colin, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to say that as an adult, basically, I get 6 hours of daycare. So basically, adults can get more than 3 hours old.
Absolutely.
I get 6 hours of daycare, 42 hours a week, basically. And they tried to cut my care package because they said I'm not using it, basically, in direct payments, because I can't get carers. There's a shortage of carers locally and nationally, and I can't get carers that weekend. But I've been having carers, basically, even if I went in hospital 8 years ago, basically, I was getting 5 hours a day then. And I was paying £10 an hour, basically. I was getting £10 an hour. Now it's gone down to now £50 an hour.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and again, that's good to hear that that wasn't the case, that you were limited in that way. But yeah, Anyway, I'm going to move on. I've got 6 minutes left. Looked at personal. Oh, so we're near the end. That's good. We can have a bit of time to talk if we want to. So to summarise, there's lots of legal rights to have advocacy through health funded processes. If the person doesn't trigger advocacy, don't stop there. Don't leave that person without an advocate if they want an advocate. Look to the guidance. Look to ask the commissioner to spot purchase. Look to if personal health budget is an option. And the other thing for managers on the call, I would kind of urge you to do is to try and collect data on how many people approach your advocacy who would like support going through health funded processes, because that's your intelligence, that's your evidence to talk to your commissioner about meeting the needs of people. It's very difficult, I think, for a commissioner to just accept, you know, that there's this need. If you've got evidence of not being able to support 20 people in a 3-month period, then that becomes a little bit more compelling, I think. So as a service, think about how you're capturing that. You know, we might call it unmet need. We might say that there's a need that we can't meet. So that's the end of the presentation. Can't believe I finished